Hey guys, today we're going to be looking at how to use an electronic balance to measure the mass of an object. A couple things you need to know before we start. This thing is electronic. It requires power, so make sure that you've got it plugged in before you start. Otherwise, you can feel pretty foolish after spending a few minutes trying to figure out why it won't turn on and then realizing that it's not plugged in. Also notice that there is a plastic protecting covering over the top of this. Before you measure the mass of anything, you'll need to open that up. And now we're ready to start working. First thing you have to do is turn it on. The on-off button is located very conveniently there in the front. Press the on button and then wait. You'll see a bunch of numbers come up on this screen. You want to wait until this reads all zeros before you do anything else. So don't put anything on the pan until this reads all zeros. Here you see it says 0.0 grams. That G stands for grams. That's the unit of mass that it's measuring in. And now, if you want to find the mass of an object, all you have to do is set it on the silver pan. So we will find the mass of this empty beaker. Place the beaker on there, and then we see the mass is 171.9 grams. Now, every once in a while, you'll see this last digit swing back and forth, say in this case between 8 or 9. It doesn't always happen, but sometimes it does. In that case, pick whichever one it seems to stay on the longest. Nothing you can do about that. So the mass of this beaker is 171.9 grams, and that is really all there is to it. Whatever you want to find the mass of, put it on the pan. Now there are some limitations to this. This will only measure masses up to 500 grams. Past that, you'll get an overload warning. You'll see this as an OL on the front screen, so I'm just going to press down on here until we get there. You'll see just after 500, it pops up OL, which stands for overload. That means you've put too much mass on it. Alright, next thing we're going to look at is something that comes up in chemistry pretty often, and so we need to be aware of how to deal with it, is how do we find the mass of just the liquid in this beaker, because I have some water in this beaker, and if I put that on the pan, what this is actually telling me is the mass of the beaker plus the mass of the water. It's measuring both of those. I don't want the mass of the beaker, I just want the mass of the water, so I need some way to do that. There are two ways to go about it. We're going to look at both of them. The easier way involves taking, well, they both involve, another beaker. So you'll need another beaker handy. Doesn't matter if it's the same size, different size, whatever, as long as it'll hold the liquid. Take an empty beaker, so this is our other one, and you place that on the balance pan, and it gives you the mass, 171.8 grams. The first way to go about this is to use what's called a tare, T-A-R-E, or zeroing the balance. You'll see this button that says 0. I'm leaving the beaker on there, and when I hit 0, the reading automatically goes to 0. So basically the balance is taking whatever the mass of the thing that's on it there and subtracting that number from it. You'll notice if I take this off, it'll swing to negative 171 grams. The negative sign will pop up there, and it'll probably be too small to see. But if I take this off, it's now reading negative 171.8 grams. Whatever I add on there will have that number subtracted from it. But very conveniently, when I put that particular beaker on there, it reads 0. So what I do now is I take that beaker and I pour the water into it. Notice that I'm not doing that on top of the electronic balance. Pouring a liquid over the top of anything electronic is a very bad idea. Take the beaker off to pour that in there. And now I can put this back on the balance, and it will read 105.1 grams. So remember, it's still ignoring the mass of the beaker. So that is reading as just the mass of the water. This water has a mass of 105.1 grams. So that's one way of doing this. The other way of doing this just involves some common sense. So I'm going to take this off the scale and hit 0 again so that it's reading 0 when nothing's on there. Let's do this. I take my now empty beaker and I put it on there. And the mass of this is 61.9 grams. Imagine I can write that down. So I write this down somewhere. I remember that it's 61.9 grams, And now I take the water and pour it in. Now it reads 166.8 grams. What I can do is take those two numbers and subtract them to find the mass of the water. Where before it was 60 some odd grams, I can subtract that number from the mass of the beaker and the water, and that will leave me with just the mass of the water. Either one of those techniques works just fine. You're welcome to use either. One thing to be sure of, though, is don't, and this happens mostly when you have beakers of the same size, don't assume that beakers of the same size will have the same mass. That's not necessarily true. So always make sure that when you do the measurements with subtraction and with zeroing out, that you're using the same beaker on the balance both times. That is a very common mistake, and while the errors from it are small, they are still errors and they are very preventable. So that's how we use an electronic balance. We'll be using this tool throughout chemistry. It's very, very useful, and in fact in almost all sciences, this is one of the basic lab tools that you will always find.